Hello and welcome back to Philosophy and Humor. And this week we're going to look at Module 9, Humor and Religion. So most of the material is from our text, Philosophy of Humor. This is Chapter 8. Now I've added a few things like I typically do in this particular module because lots of other ideas floating around, especially ones by John Morial. Now, as we normally do, we always do a quick overview of the previous module. And last week we looked at humor and ethics. The main ideas were that humor has an association with taboo subjects. We've talked about the superiority theory, the idea that the speaker of the joke feels elevated in relation to the subjects or the content of the joke. And that relationship entails some kind of social responsibility. What are we going to laugh at? Who are we going to laugh at? And when we use exaggeration for humorous effect, how far are we going to push that? Is it a mild sort of slight change of reality, or is it a caricature, a stereotype? Each of those do have social responsibilities that we need to keep in mind when we're trading in humor. Humor also promotes intellectual moral values. There are many good things about humor. Stimulates original and creative thinking. When we think humorously, often we think creatively. One of the good ways in which we can think of humor in terms of its ethical dimension is if we talk about the ethnic part of humor. And we talked about coping humor, the fact that humor that is directed towards a common enemy or a common situation brings people together, right? It brings them into a sense of solidarity, especially during a time of repression. You can imagine all the Hitler jokes that were around back in World War II. I'm sure there were lots. And right now they're kind of, useless. They're really not, they're not relevant. But at that time they would have been. So it brings people together and designates one group by means of solidarity over and against another. But when you do that, you're also dividing those groups. So one group feels a sense of solidarity, but it's doing it at the expense of another group or another person. So that's kind of the double-edged side or sword, we'll say, of humor. It brings people together, but it also can divide them. Now, when we talk about ethnic humor in particular, not just coping humor, but ethnic jokes in particular, we find two different kinds. The one is the stupid ethnic, or the other is the canny ethnic. Now, the stupid ethnic joke, it's anybody that's vain or greedy, ruthless, kind of deficient in some way. And the other one, to be canny, is to be shrewd and calculating, stingy, crafty, underhanded, sly. Both of those are not things that we want to be associated with. The reason why those jokes are there is to remind us that those are the kinds of folks we shouldn't be. And that's the reason why they exist. So finally, the last one we looked at in humor and ethics was the fact that jokes ultimately are fictions, right? We don't listen to jokes to learn about the world or to tell each other the truth, because we know that jokes exaggerate reality for humorous effect. But it is the degree to which it exaggerates reality that we end up having some serious issues with racist and sexist humor, humor that trades in stereotypes and caricatures, and those kinds of jokes really perpetuate negative stereotypes that we have of other individuals or groups of individuals. And so really the rule of thumb is the following: the more discriminated against the ethnic minority, the less comfortable we should be about making jokes about them. So the reason why that's important is because those kinds of jokes simply reinforce the social structure under which these people find themselves in this inferior or disenfranchised position. So it's really not something we should be laughing at, because when we trade in those kinds of stereotypes, we're in a sense acknowledging and condoning the very system that holds them down. Okay, so that was a brief in fact, less than 4 minutes, an overview of humor and ethics. Now we're going to move a little bit further, and we're going to look at humor and religion. Now, we talked about this, I think I mentioned the very first time we got together, that our capacity for spiritual thought kind of came around at about the same time as our ability to entertain incongruous thoughts. And I've stressed this over and over again, that our minds can be divided in two at any given time. And they're divided in paying attention to what we're seeing and also thinking about what should be. Now, in the same way that we can do that in terms of humor, there are theorists that believe that spiritual thought, which is thinking about the world, but thinking beyond the world. So in the sense that we look at things side by side, with religion, we think on this side and on that side. On this side is us and reality, and on the other side are natural laws, laws of nature, metaphysical ideas, religious ideas. But we think about them as coexisting. And therein lies the capacity for humor. So that's kind of where the relationship is. We can look at what we call here the natural plane, the everyday reality, the world around us. But we can also entertain a supernatural, or if you're into philosophy, a metaphysical realm. And we can entertain both of those at the same time. This first clip's about 3 minutes long. Michael Jr., comedian, fairly safe, no F-bombs here. And his joke is basically, what if you were the younger sibling of Jesus? So there's something natural and supernatural. We may have younger siblings, whether they're brothers or sisters, or we at least know people that are this way. But this routine is kind of fun because here we can see our capacity to have spiritual thoughts, because we can think of Jesus being a certain kind of person. He isn't just, a man that walked on the earth, but had other metaphysical properties. But we can also entertain the idea that he may have had a younger brother. And depending on what side of the religious history, sort of camp that you're on, some individuals believe that Jesus did have a brother. So Michael Jr. sort of entertains and sort of trades in this idea, but for humorous effect. So have a look at it. I've checked all the links. They are right down below here. So click away to Michael Jr. about the younger sibling of Jesus, and we'll see you back in just a moment. Okay, so not only did humor and religion coexist roughly at the same time, or they started at the same time, but there is also the belief by historians that comedy, tragedy, and religion have been interconnected for more than 2,000 years, roughly 2,500 years. And we know that because tragedy and comedy emerged out of the fertility festivals in honor of Dionysus. And Dionysus pretty well covers it all. So as a god, he was the god of the grape harvest, winemaking and wine. Okay, that makes sense. Ritual madness, fertility, theater, religious ecstasy. That's a tall order. That's all one god. Covers a broad range of interests. So we can see out of that comedy, religion, and tragedy sort of mingling together under this, or within this one individual of Dionysus. So very interesting character, to say the least. Now, as time went on, that connection between humor and religion really began to separate. And certainly during the Dark Ages, the early Middle Ages, really at the time when the church was basically controlling the population and deciding what social formations and society would look like. And even at this early point, the notion of society really didn't even exist. You had the state, which was in the form of the church. The church ran the show. And it decided that humor and fertility and religious madness and wine and so on, that was a separate thing. There was no sort of interrelationship. There was a clean separation. And so it took a long time before that connection that was there originally 2,500 years ago actually came back. So very slowly we see playwrights like Shakespeare. We see other playwrights throughout the Middle Ages starting to deal with tragic and comic subjects. And at this point, there's still a fairly clear distinction between these two types of theatrical presentations of the world. And really, ultimately, the difference was that comedy simply it presented to us a different perspective on the same world. Now, remember a few weeks ago, I talked about Jean Morial giving us a distinction between the comic and the tragic hero. Same thing is going on here. Still the same world, and we can look at it from one of two positions, one of tragedy or one of comedy. Now, tragedy and comedy can look at that same world from different perspectives. They can focus sometimes on the problem of evil, which is an ongoing perennial debate. Whichever religion you belong to, it may have a particular sort of approach or attitude towards evil. But when you think about evil and how it sits within comedy, comedy and evil is maybe going as far as like a canny, ethnic joke, somebody who's shrewd and sly and underhanded. It's not evil in the sense of a mass murder. It's just evil that this is what people should not do, right? We're talking about now the difference between what people do or things as they are versus the way things ought to be. Now, as you can imagine, in tragedy, the idea of evil is obviously a far richer one. Now, here is a quick clip of Rami Youssef first appearing, I think this is about 2017, on Stephen Colbert's show, and I wanted to just kind of look at what could have been a tragic, what has been a tragic issue, which is the existence of ISIS. So we could look at ISIS one of two ways, as a tragic moment in recent history, or we can turn around and look at the same material and take Rami Youssef's perspective of finding some kind of comedic gold out of this material. Sounds surprising, but have a look at the clip. It's very funny, and it works with that material in a really interesting way. So tragedy, comedy, same topic. In this case, with Rami Youssef, he's going to be looking at it from a comedic point of view. Have a look at it, and I'll see you back in a moment. Okay, so humor and laughter may appear amoral. It apparently has no moral content. It does not tell the truth. It is beyond moral judgment. We've talked about this last week when we looked at it from an ethical point of view. Now, because it is amoral and beyond these judgments, you would think that humor and religion would have a rather strained relationship. But we found, as we've just discovered, roughly 2,500 years ago, it did have a relationship. These two ideas were tied together in a very consistent, significant kind of way. Now, today we can say religion and humor are incompatible for a number of different reasons, and we're going to look at those now. Now, the first one is religion seeks meaning in the world. Humor, on the other hand, challenges meaning. It undermines meaning. It plays with meaning. Incongruous humor is exactly that. It's upsetting and usurping and turning meaning on its head. So religion looks for meaning. It seeks meaning in the world. Humor does the opposite. It literally turns it upside down. The second one is that religion seeks reason and rationality. It looks to see that the world is reasonable and there are certain expectations, also mores and traditions and customs that are based on reason and rationality. And sure enough, especially with incongruous humor, humor thrives on absurdity, ambiguity, strangeness, right? It challenges social norms and conventions constantly. So the two of them, as you can see, are quite different. Number three is the fact that religion is conservative, or it is a conserving force. And humor does exactly the opposite. It merely goes along and it's just wild anarchy. Think of the Carnivalesque from a few weeks ago. The Carnivalesque is anarchic, right? It turns the world upside down. So it doesn't try to conserve the world. Now, carnival humor eventually does restore the world, yes. But when we look at it as a kind of a conservative force, religion clearly is more so than humor. The fourth one is that religion favors security, reliability. This also sort of ties into this notion of expectations and norms. Humor, again, unconventional, experimental, absurd, anarchic. It literally goes in the opposite direction. 5, religion favors predictability. Again, expectations, norms, reasonable behavior. Humor thrives on surprise, the unexpected punchline. So again, very different. And the last two are very important. Religion frowns on sex and aggression. Humor often is sexual, especially taboo jokes. When we talked about Freud and that psychic mechanism that holds down things that should be kept in our unconscious, or the filter that we have that we know that we shouldn't repeat a joke, for example, in mixed company or in front of people that, we care about their response. Humor is sexual, hedonistic, self-indulgent, absurd, violent sometimes. And religion really shies away from that, right? It frowns on sexual and aggressive matters. And finally, the last one, which really kind of comes back to the first, which is seeking meaning, is it also tries to seek some kind of higher moral truth. some kind of motivation to allow people to make sense of their life and to know that they're doing the right thing. Guess what? Humor does the opposite, right? It plays with all kinds of forms of humor, and it itself is not even truthful, right? We know that it does not trade in truths. It simply plays with expectation. It exaggerates things, exaggerates reality. So as you can see, religion and humor don't seem to have a whole lot in common. And on the surface, it doesn't. Now, Jon Stewart and Grant Gordon and the other comedians, what I want you to notice is how their humor is based not on the central tenets of religion, whether it's Judaism or Buddhism or Catholicism or whatever. What they're playing with are the particularities of religion, the behavioral traits, for example. So Jon Stewart's clip here, when we think about the content of his humor, it has a lot to do with the way people behave. It's never really about Judaism or religion per se, right? It's, like I say, it's central tenets. It has to do with just outward behavior that those who are not a member of that community may look at it as something unusual. And that's really what all three of these comedians, starting now with Jon Stewart, will be looking at. And so here I just wanted to think about the ethics of humor. Is it really as damaging as we think? If we pay careful attention, we realize that religion itself comes off reasonably unscathed. Instead, it's just those weird little quirks that we associate with the form of behavior that is whatever religion they happen to be trying to make fun of. So have a look at Jon Stewart on religion, and I'll see you back in a moment. Okay, now humor in Christianity. Christianity was the primary motive force during the Dark Ages and the early Middle Ages. It was really the church that rose to the top, right, of monotheistic religions. But even at this point, Christianity was still surrounded by Judaism and Islam at this point as well. Now, early Christians, as you can imagine, because they were coming out of the tradition of monotheistic thought, they were in charge, right? They were calling the shots. As a result, they were highly critical of humor and laughter. And much like Plato, this should sound familiar. Plato would have thought the same way. He was not a Christian, of course, but Christianity bore a lot of ideas from Plato, including this one. So early Christians, Christian fathers, were highly critical of humor and laughter for exactly the same reasons as Plato. It gives into the sort of hedonistic pleasures of the world. And instead, when we think about what really sort of motivates a person, I have to suffer for Christ. This was really an important tenet in early Christian thought, the fact that pain and suffering was a good thing. To be laughing and to be having a good time and to just sort of being relaxing and being pleasured by just where you are, the people you're with, enjoying yourself was not a Christian thing to do. Pain and suffering, instead, was what was considered ennobling. So early Christians, like Plato, thought that self-control, self-restraint were good virtues or positive virtues. And like Plato as well, laughter gave into those baser instincts. And because of that relationship between baser instincts, pleasure, and so on, and laughter, it was linked to sin, because it was a temporary relief from labor. So on the one hand, Christian fathers recognize what laughter does, right? It's relief from labor. It's relief from the unending drudgery of being a serf or some kind of poor, hard done by individual living on a farm and basically giving up 85% of your grain to the Lord or to the master of some sort, whoever's in charge, and you have just barely enough to live. So laughter, and guess what? Laughter at the expense of the church fathers offered that relief. So the church fathers were not blind to what it did. Laughter provided that temporary relief from the very pain that those people caused to the individuals laughing. So they knew that relationship. So they associated with sin because they didn't want people to do it, and the punishment of God for defying him in the Garden of Eden. So the labor was not because they were asking for all of your grain. The labor comes from the fact that God had forsaken us. And, we should have stayed in the Garden of Eden. We should have stayed gardeners. We should have stayed in agriculture. But instead, we left, right? We bit into the tree of knowledge and off we went. So laughter in this case is looked at as a kind of mockery. The situation that God has put us into, we're mocking it. Think of it, Plato would have lost his mind. The early church fathers also. So that was the power of laughter. They knew it, and that's why they labeled it as sinful. So this is the early Middle Ages after 1000 AD, which sounds like a long time ago, and it was over 1,000 years ago. The church finally eased up a tiny bit and said, look, now there is a distinction within laughter between good and bad laughter. And when we think of pictures of the Pope, especially pictures that we see a lot more of the Pope, certainly over the last 30 or 40 years, mass media and social media have lots and lots of pictures of these people. They often are smiling in a very kind of benign, sort of respectful sort of way. It's not a grin, it's just a smile. And this was kind of the crack in the armor of the early church, even making that distinction between good and bad laughter. Bad laughter, of course, would be any kind of joke that would lend itself to superiority theory, for example, or incongruity. And so you could laugh in a good way. You could smile. There was something saintly about it. It was part of being in good humor. If you could smile and occasionally sort of rise above it, that was not a bad thing. So we're just talking now about tragedy and comedy and the role of the church and so on. This is a short clip. It's not funny, but it is interesting because it gives us a sense of what the medieval theater was all about at this point. So the Middle Ages, 500 to 1000 AD, and then from about 1000 to roughly 1500. That's the era that we're talking about now. We're kind of quickly moving through, let's say 2000 years of history, but we're around the medieval period, which is 1000 to 1400, 1500, depending where you are. And it's at this point that the church finally begins to make these sort of important distinctions between types of humor, types of laughter, the importance of the smile, and so on. So have a quick look at that, and then we'll see you back in a moment. Now, one really interesting character in the church is the notion of the holy fool. Now, the holy fool has been around for a very, very long time, since about the 6th century. The Greek church, for example, had this custom of setting aside the day after Easter as a day of laughter. Now, you think, okay, it could be any day, but no, it is a very particular day. It's a day after Easter. And what is Easter? Well, it is the crucifixion and the resurrection of Christ. And it is the resurrection of Christ that is celebrated more so than the pain and suffering. And what it is, it's a celebration of the joke that God plays on Satan by resurrecting Jesus, by saying, sorry, you can't kill him. I'm taking him back. So it is a celebration of the fact that even evil forces, the fact that the evil force at this point were the occupying Roman army, putting Jesus Christ to death. And the celebration is that he is resurrected. He's brought back from the dead. So the 6th century Greek church, along with that, developed this notion of a holy fool. So around the same time as this notion of a holy fool and the tradition of it, and again, this is sort of in a single sentence, it's the idea that Christians are fools for Christ's sake. Now, say that carefully, for Christ's sake, not to swear, but to act like a clown as an expression of piety. And so let's unpack this, because it's an idea that you may not have heard before, unless you belong to the Greek Orthodox Church, of course, and this is quite an important character. But the holy fool is a representation of the person who defies reason and rationality. Now, remember, I did say earlier that the church did favor reason and rationality, but here they kind of take what humor can do and use it to its own advantage. And so they have this holy fool that acts like a clown because he or she is acting differently from everyone else, that is following tradition, following reason and rationality, and going to work and getting a job and just being sort of a normal individual. So let's look into this in a bit more detail. So this comic spirit really kind of comes into being around the medieval Christianity. This is the period of time we're talking about now. And we have Holy Innocents' Day, the Feast of Asses, the Feast of Fools. All of these have to do with the fact that Christ was, when you think about it, he comes in, he travels on an ass, a donkey, into Jerusalem, and he knows he's facing certain death. I mean, he already knows what's going to happen. But he arrives as a kind of such a lowly figure. And someone like Bakhtin, for example, would have said, here is the King of Kings arriving basically through the side door, on an ass. I mean, he is belittled in the worst way possible. So the notion of going against the grain is something that is part of that medieval Christian spirit. And it is celebrated partly in the Holy Fool, and then partly in these other festivals, Holy Innocents' Day, Feast of Asses, Feast of Fools, and so on. That's where this is coming from. This is a short clip on the Holy Fool, a little bit more background information. St. Paul's idea of Christians are fools for Christ's sake. And have a look at that to give yourself a little bit more background information. And then when you come back, we're going to explore this a little bit more detail. Okay. So the Feast of Fools, also associated with Carnival, because this is all kind of happening at the same time. This was an ecclesiastical festival where priests and clerks, typically the church fathers that would be engaged in very important, dignified, and pious activities, now turn around and engage in impious activities, things that aren't so religious, so Christian, so proper. And they are allowed to parody the church dignitaries and rituals. That's Carnival, right? The world turned upside down. So the laughter that's generated out of that, right? This feast symbolizes vice and human failings. It celebrates our humanity. Ultimately, that's what it does. It celebrates the fact that we sometimes don't have control over our body, that we do have base desires, that we are sometimes almost animalistic. And that acknowledgement and celebration is also an acknowledgement that we need that spiritual deliverance. So we acknowledge on the one hand that we are just this side of animalistic, but on the other hand, we have the capacity for spiritual salvation. So it is a way for us to reconcile these two worlds. Remember, the world of what is and the world of what should be, the world of the physical, the world of the metaphysical, right? These two worlds, the natural, the supernatural, these coexist in our minds. Same thing is happening here. When we are celebrating the Feast of Fools, we're showing to the world that on the one hand, we are sometimes just biological entities, right? With drives and urges and needs. But at the same time, we have this other capacity for spiritual salvation. And we get that through religious thought. But let's not kid ourselves. It was also a chance to let off a whole lot of steam. So humor, laughter that is generated from these kinds of characteristics, the Holy Fool, also found in Judaism and Islam. These individuals are there sort of within the public realm, the social realm, to shock people out of their conventional ways of thinking. The conventional ways of thinking that perhaps there is a God, that there isn't a metaphysical realm, that there aren't natural laws or laws of nature. So these fools come along and, relative to us, appear quite strange. They say strange things. But what they're trying to do, or at least the motive behind them, is to shock us out of this conventional way of thinking in order to make us more receptive to that metaphysical world, that supernatural world, to that otherness of that is religious experience. So again, none of this can work unless we can hold these two thoughts in our heads. And of course, humor does that, but so does religion, right? The natural and the supernatural, what is here and what is other. And so that otherness of religious experience, because it is so different from what we normally experience, it takes a holy fool to act as a kind of vessel to let us know this is what's going on. So the quality of being foolish in the sense that we're not going to be following reason and rationality to the degree that we're not going to also be aware of that metaphysical realm, that religious dimension of our existence. So the behavior of the fool becomes a kind of way to undermine reason, right? And the material world, because the material world is going to eventually die away. And if you are a believer, you know that, And this should also sound like Plato. Now, this is not a philosophy course, but Plato felt exactly the same way, that what is really beautiful and eternal and ahistorical is that metaphysical realm, that supernatural realm, the otherness of reality. That's what's going to last forever. The material world is just going to die away. We're going to die away. So why should we be so deeply connected to that material world? That sounds really strange. It sounds foolish. And that's what the Holy Fool does. They offer this new perspective on what is, on the surface, almost irrational. You're asking me to believe something that doesn't exist? Yes, I am, says the Holy Fool. That's what I'm trying to do. So the Fool offers insight into the fact that the natural world, the material world, is going to die away. It will come into being and it will die away. We will come into being and die away. And there will be something else behind all of this, right? On that supernatural realm, that if you just think about it, you can grasp it. And so that's what the Holy Fool does. It goes against the conventions of, well, I'm just going to get up, go to work, and go to sleep, go back to work tomorrow, and that's all I'm going to do, right? Surely there's got to be something better to do. And that's what the Fool does. It points these things out. So what it does is it, just like Carnival, it takes the whole reality fantasy hierarchy and turns it on its head and said, look, the real fantasy is to believe in this material world. That's what is a real fantasy, that somehow this material world will continue to exist. And so the Fool rejects reality and rationality and instead embraces what is, from our perspective, right on this side, a kind of irrational world that is completely absent of logic and reason. Because we can't see it, we have to believe it, right? That's what the leap of faith is all about. And the Fool shows us how and where to leap into this other world, because he or she, the Holy Fool, is the vehicle, the vessel by which we're going to be able to gain access to this world that is beyond the material world that is here and now. So the Fool is foolish or strange in the sense that he turns reality and fantasy, or the natural and the supernatural, upside down, turns it upside down and says, what you should really be working towards is that supernatural metaphysical realm. Everything here is just going to die away, right? It's going to be gone. So that is basically the Holy Fool. Interesting character, interesting ideas. Here, I just want to look a little bit about Judaism, because it has probably the longest history of humor and as a coping mechanism. So Judaism and humor, that bond is more strong. It's stronger, I should say, than Christianity or Islam. And Jewish humor is very good at dealing with the incomprehensible, right? Things that are bizarre, illogical, things that just don't seem to make sense. Now, David Finkelstein, a Jewish comedian, again, listen to what he says. He's not attacking Judaism. What he is pointing out, critique in quotations we'll say, is the behavior of individuals who are devout, Jewish believers. So if you really believe the Jewish faith, you will act in a certain way that is different, unusual, and relative to the rest of the people. So David Finkelstein's stand-up routine, have a look at it and come back in a couple minutes. So what's happening with Judaism and humor is the fact that Judaism allows debate. It is aware that there is a lot of issues that are never resolved, and it is up to the thinkers and the rabbis and others that study the Talmud to try to figure it out. So there's lots of debate, and of course when there's debating there can be the occasional joke, but there is a degree of non-resolution in issues. And so argumentation, debate, it's really front and center of the Jewish tradition, because compared to Christianity, which has a pope, right, there is no final word. There's no final answer in Judaism. It's up to the believer to figure out what something means. So as Cohen says, right, there's no systematic finality because there is no pope. There is no final person at the top that says, this is what it means. It's up to them. So it makes going through the world and making sense of it a little bit more difficult. Now, because of that, because there is no conclusive closure in issues, the Jewish tradition is also more flexible. It is more able to deal with things that are incomprehensible because it accepts life as sometimes confusing, irrational, unusual. It lacks simple answers. But ultimately what it's doing is acknowledging that the human condition is exactly that. It is very aware that to live is to sometimes be confused, be disappointed, be frustrated, not come up with the answers. And so laughter acknowledges the human condition in this particular case. And what is the sort of generating the laughter is the difference between the way the world should be and the way the world is. And is that not really what humor is doing all the time? So the tradition of Judaism accepts more readily than Christianity that the world is sometimes incomprehensible and that the human condition is incomprehensible. And so when we are doing this, we're acknowledging the limitations of our thought. There are simply certain things that we just don't know and we cannot know. And so for Cohen, he believes that laughter is an acceptance of the world as it is. Confusing, illogical, unyielding sometimes. It's a world that is endlessly incomprehensible, always baffling, a world that is beyond us, and yet it's our world. It's the one we live in. So if we're laughing at the situation, there may be a hint that beyond the illogical could, perhaps, might lie some degree of meaning. And of course, that's when religion comes in. It provides that temporary glue that holds it all together, as irrational as things may be. Grant Gordon, who is in fact a practicing Buddhist Jew, again, listen carefully to the kinds of ideas that he's presenting. It's not an attack on Buddhism or Catholicism or Judaism at all. It's just this unique perspective on following these two particular religions. So have a look at that, and we'll see you back in a moment. Now, the last sort of religion I want to look at, because this is another one that kind of ties in with incongruity, and that is the relationship between Buddhism and humor. Now, it does have a role in Buddhist thought, but as you can imagine, when it first began, humor and laughter was discouraged by the Buddhist masters because it was for the same reasons as Plato would have indicated, that it sort of appeals to our base instincts. We're laughing at other people's misfortunes. It's malicious sometimes. So it really was an offense, right? It was offensive to laugh in public. And so this was something that really kind of went against the grain of Buddhism, which is to search for release from that pain and sorrow, the pain and sorrow that accompanies the human condition, right? That illogical, incomprehensible dimension of life where meaning and rationality and reason aren't enough, right? Something just isn't right. So Buddhism really tries to find a release away from pain and sorrow and that material world. So humor and laughter found in Zen Buddhism. This is a religion brought into China around the 6th century AD. Now, we have here kind of the humorless version of Buddhism. Eventually, prior to that, that's kind of the situation. But Chinese Buddhism, one of the main figures, one of the most sort of, I don't want to say stereotypical, but one of the images that we see quite often is of a smiling Buddha, a smiling, laughing Buddha. And so that view of like, don't sweat the small stuff, rise above it, right? These are slogans and ideas that we throw at each other, and it's true, right? Don't sweat the small stuff. That's thinking from a Buddhist perspective, right? Rise above it. Don't let the small things, tie you down and drive you crazy. So the difference between the early version of Buddhism and Zen Buddhism is that difference between almost philosophical positions about the world. So Hinduism as well and Buddhism share these a belief in reincarnation, and each time we come back, we achieve a slightly better chance of achieving that enlightenment, right? That full understanding, but we don't know. There's also a tendency towards nonviolence, a tendency towards emotional detachment and mental flexibility. This should remind you of the similarities between humor and philosophy, the emotional detachment, mental flexibility, tolerance for ambiguity. Those things are the overlaps between humor and philosophy. Both of those do the same thing. So you can be philosophical about the world and the human condition. You can be like Kierkegaard and sort of try to not get, the small things to tie you down or tie you up in certain cases. Or even Schopenhauer. Remember that the grief that's brought on by thinking of the world as it should be versus what it is. You don't want it to cause depression. You want it to cause, in fact, a temporary smile and laughter going, well, we'll try again next time. Let's see what we get. So Hinduism and Buddhism share some of these features, and in particular, emotional detachment and mental flexibility. Those two things in particular are important. So the noble truth in Buddhism is that life is suffering. And if you can kind of keep your head above water and you can look at the world that way, life, yes, it's full of disappointments and suffering and setbacks and what's one sort of another. But okay, if that's the case, if we can keep that sense of humor about us, like Schopenhauer asked us to do, and Kierkegaard as well, if we can keep a sense of humor about our human condition, that life of disappointment and suffering may not be as difficult or as arduous or as painful as if you were to look at it from a tragic point of view. You want to look at it from a humorous point of view. And if you can do that, you are able to now not only rise above it, but separate yourself from that pain, separate yourself from that material world. I think this is the last clip here. George Carlin. Now, George Carlin is not a Buddhist, but I want you to listen to his words very carefully. He calls it critical objectivity. What I call what he's doing is Buddhist thinking. And he's doing it by telling us how he was able to achieve that kind of moment of Zen, that disconnect from reality, by simply stepping back and deciding he was going to simply comment on it. So he took Kierkegaard's and Schopenhauer's suggestions, their recommendations, did exactly that. But Carlin and his work, and I think many of you know who he is, in this particular one, there is an F-bomb, so I'm going to just let you know. Listen to his words and see how he describes to us the way in which he achieves that Zen moment, because he does step back, right? He does step back from the insanity that is U.S. politics or, the social world that he lives in, and he looks back and he comments on it. But what he's doing is releasing himself from that pain, because it can be painful. But I want you to listen to it and think of what we just talked about in terms of Buddhist thought and what George Carlin is saying on how to achieve that Zen moment. So have a look at it, and we'll see you back in a moment. Okay, so as we saw with George Carlin, the goal of Zen Buddhism is to free oneself from the ego. The ego doesn't mean lose our minds. It means the satisfaction, the endless satisfaction of the ego. And if you think about it, it really is the endless deferment of satisfaction. We no sooner get one thing, somebody down the street gets something nicer, bigger, brighter, whatever, and we agonize over it. So we go and we buy a bigger thing, and somebody else gets an even bigger, on and on it goes. It's endless. So are we ever really satisfied? No, we're endlessly deferred from that satisfaction. So if we want to free ourselves from that, that doesn't mean don't ever buy things. It just means you buy something and you buy what you need, not something you have to have because your neighbor has the same thing or has a bigger version of it. If you can do that, you can free yourself from the way the ego wraps itself around the world so tightly that you are fixated on what everybody else is doing, and everybody else is happy except me, and everybody else has got stuff except me. No, that's what Buddhism is asking you not to do. So you free yourself from that pain, and really that's the meaning of life, is to rise above it in some way. So one of the ways in which you can do it is using humor, because humor subverts those concepts and it creates those contrasts between what is and what should be. So if you can kind of sidestep reason and rationality, and these days, reason and rationality are dressed up as advertising. And advertising continuously bombards us with, get this new thing, you got to get that, you got to get this. And just like Carlin said, you got to step back, sit in the corner with a notepad and just write these things down and say, wow, we're really kind of strange people. So humor allows us to sidestep and kind of get around an obstacle. We don't crash headlong through it. We just figure out a way around it, right? Our mental flexibility will allow us to do that. And if we can do that, as we are sidestepping around this obstacle, we can open up our minds, right, to different ways of doing things, new versions of the truth, because truth is conditional and it depends on our lived reality. And if we can at least absorb that and be aware of where we are and who we are, we're less likely to get caught up in these kinds of issues. So the Buddhist message and the humor message as well is to step back emotionally from that suffering world, and things are likely going to get better. Now, that doesn't mean I don't care. No, it does not. What it does mean is care about the things that do matter. Care about the things that you can change. Care about the things that are going to make maybe other people's lives better. So if you step back emotionally from that world that suffers and pick and choose the things that you want to really engage with them authentically and meaningfully. And humor allows us to think critically and have that kind of mental flexibility that is required to be able to sidestep around all these obstacles. So if you are Buddhist, you're going to eliminate the suffering by eliminating the things that make you suffer, right? The latest iPhone or the latest whatever. Just buy a damn phone, and as long as it works, that's it. Be happy with it. It's a phone. It works. So if we can minimize our attachment to these earthly material things, we're likely to be slightly better off. So that's it. In a little over 45 minutes, humor and religion. Your next reflection essay is due not tomorrow, but tomorrow being Sunday, but a week Sunday. I just want to let everyone know that it is coming up. So we'll see each other on Monday. And until then, if you have any questions, please contact me via email. But we'll see each other on Monday, and we'll do a quick sort of run through, and I'll talk a little bit more about the reflection essay that's due next week. So have a good weekend. It's Saturday afternoon. Enjoy the rest of the weekend. It's beautiful out there, and we'll see you soon.